أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا يستوي أصحاب النار وأصحاب الجنة. أصحاب الجنة هم الفائزون. لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله. وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون. هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة. هو الرحمن الرحيم. هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العليم الجبار المتكبر. سبحان الله عما يشركون. هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى. يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم.
Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I apologize for this slight delay in start of proceedings for tonight, but I'm very pleased and would like to welcome all of you to this very important gathering tonight to discuss and hear views from two very distinguished speakers on who really runs the war on terror. I would like to invite Mrs. Fatima Grimm and Miss Yvonne Ridley to please move to the stage. We are honored to be in such distinguished company tonight. Who really runs the war on terror? The world is going through extremely dangerous times. You don't need me to tell you that. No matter what kind of media you switch into, TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, everything is full of it. This is a very topical subject, and we are privileged to have two very distinguished speakers to share their thoughts on this topical subject with us tonight. We will hear a preamble on the subject for tonight from Mrs. Fatima Grimm. Fatima Grimm, born in Germany, embraced Islam in 1960 and has worked for several years for the German Muslim magazine Al-Islam. She has worked with an expert team of Muslim women on German translation of the Holy Quran, with an expert team and with comments from selected scholars such as Yusuf Ali, Muhammad Asad, Daryabadi, Sayyid Qutb, Sayyidna Maududi, and this was published in 1996 by Bavaria Verlag Munich. This has 3,000 pages, and subsequently its editions have been published in Russian in 2000, Bosnian 2001, and English edition has just been concluded. Polish and Spanish translations are also underway. Mrs. Fatima Grimm has also published a collection of lectures in a book, Der Islam mit den Augen einer Frau, Islam viewed by a woman. Bavaria Verlag is the publisher, and this was published in 1999. In 1976, she participated in Festival of Islam in London at the turn of the Islamic century with a lecture on the family life in Islam. She has also lectured in Algeria in 1977 at the occasion of Women's Year. She was also part of South African tour and toured many major cities in that part of the world, and participated in Muslim Youth Movement Conference in Cape Town in 1977, and has twice lectured at Nigerian women's conferences and MSA conference in Canada in 1998. She is constantly engaged in dialogue with non-Muslims, Muslims all over Germany and Europe. She has published articles in many Muslim magazines, lectured in meetings of German-speaking Muslims and youth camps in Germany. She is married to Muhammad Abdul Karim Grimm and is living in Hamburg, where she has one of her own sons, 4 stepchildren, and 8 step-grandchildren. So certainly a family concept within Islam is not new to her. I would like to invite her to talk to us on a preamble for tonight's topic of who runs the war on terror. Thank you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Who runs the war on terrorism? As Yvonne told us the other night, there were about 15 million of people all around the world taking to the street in order to oppose the war, which is now threatening us for such a long time already. In my opinion, it is not at all people who are afraid for their own skins that went out to voice their strong disapproval. Even far-off places like Australia, South America, and Black Africa showed their solidarity. All that is going on in New York these days is quite out of reach of my simple understanding. I was always of the opinion that the UN were established to prevent war and not to pass resolutions that war may be carried out. I wonder whether this has to do with the bad conscience so many people had when the war on Afghanistan was conducted, resulting in so many dead and disabled civilians, and never, not even to this day, achieving the alleged aim. What I'm really most grateful for in these days is that I have met in person someone like Yvonne Ridley. In my opinion, she is the most wonderful ambassador of us women, so brave and to the point in what she says. I would like to recite for her, with your kind help, the last verse of Surah 2, first in Arabic and then in English. Would you please join me? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha, laha ma kasabat wa alayha ma iktasabat. Rabbana la tu'akhizna in nasina aw akhtana. Rabbana wa la tahmil alayna isran kama hamaltahu ala alladhina min qablina. Rabbana wa la tuhammilna ma la taqata lana bih. Wa'fu 'anna waghfir lana warhamna. Anta maulana fansurna ala al-qawmil kafirin. Sadaqallah al-azim. And in English, on no soul does God place a burden greater than it can bear. It gets every good that it earns, and it suffers every ill that it earns. Pray, our Lord, condemn us not if we forget or fall into error. Our Lord, lay not on us a burden like that which you did lay on those before us. Our Lord, lay not on us a burden greater than we can bear. Blot out our sins and grant us forgiveness. Have mercy on us. You are our protector. Help us against those who stand against faith. May Allah Almighty guide our Yvonne and guard and protect her with His loving care, as He always does with those struggling in His way. Fi sabilillah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Grimm, for that very touching tribute and a great introduction. It's now my privilege and honor to introduce Miss Yvonne Ridley. Miss Yvonne Ridley is a freelance journalist and peace campaigner who made the headlines in September 2001 when she was captured by Taliban in Afghanistan. After sneaking into the country to write humanitarian reports, during her captivity, America and Britain launched its war on Afghanistan, and Miss Ridley sat and watched, terrified and helpless, as bombs dropped near her prison cell in Kabul. When she was released after her 10 days ordeal at the hands of the so-called most brutal, evil regime of Taliban, she shocked the world by revealing that her captors had treated her with dignity, courtesy, and respect. Having realized the futility of war, she became a passionate peace campaigner. Shortly after returning to the UK, she began to read the Quran and study Islam. This was an undertaking she had given and promise she had made with her captors. What started out as an academic project has rapidly turned into a spiritual journey, and we look forward to her words tonight on a very important subject: who runs terror today. Thank you. Ms. Yvonne.
For those of you who've heard my previous speeches, you know I always begin it by dedicating my speech to somebody, and it's usually a Palestinian. Well, I'm going to break with that tradition tonight and dedicate my speech to a very courageous American, a man called John Brady Keisling. He was a US diplomat based in the American Embassy in Greece. I have here his letter of resignation that he sent to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell. It's a very long letter, very brave letter. I won't read it all out, but I will read it in part because it is relevant to what we're talking about tonight. He wrote and told Colin Powell, "Our fervent pursuit of war with Iraq is driving us to squander the international legitimacy that has been America's most potent weapon of both offence and defence since the days of Woodrow Wilson. We have begun to dismantle the largest and most effective web of international relations the world has ever known. Our current course will bring instability and danger, not security. The sacrifice of global interests to domestic politics and to bureaucratic self-interest is nothing new, and it is certainly not a uniquely American problem. Still, we have not seen such systematic distortion of intelligence, such systematic manipulation of American opinion since the war on Vietnam. The September 11 tragedy left us stronger than before, rallying around us a vast international coalition to cooperate for the first time in a systematic way against the threat of terrorism. But rather than take credit for those successes and build on them, this administration has chosen to make terrorism a domestic political tool, enlisting a scattered and largely defeated Al-Qaeda as its bureaucratic ally. We spread disproportionate terror and confusion in the public mind, arbitrarily linking the unrelated problems of terrorism and Iraq. Even when our aims were not in question, our consistency is at issue. The model of Afghanistan is little comfort to allies wondering on what basis we plan to rebuild the Middle East and in whose image and interests. Have we indeed become blind, as Russia is blind in Chechnya, as Israel is blind in the occupied territories, to our own advice that overwhelming military power is not the answer to terrorism? These are remarkable words from this American diplomat, or now former American diplomat. I have the full text of his letter if anyone wants to see it later. But I just thought it was very appropriate to the subject tonight, which is about just who is running the war on terror. As a journalist, words are my tools, the tools of my trade. But there is one word I would like to ban from the dictionary, just totally obliterate, eradicate, because it is becoming increasingly meaningless, and that word is terrorist. In these difficult days, it is becoming increasingly difficult to tell the warriors from the terrorists. And how do you really define a terrorist? If you ask US President George W. Bush, he will tell you that a terrorist is anyone who doesn't stand shoulder to shoulder with him. You are either with me or against me. It is as simple as that. Obviously, I have to disagree, because that would make me, and probably a large proportion of people in this room, a terrorist. If you ask an Afghan farmer the definition of a terrorist, he will tell you it is a person who flies 30,000 feet above his country, dropping cluster bombs on his family and his land. If you ask the father of the bride at a Pashtun wedding in Afghanistan last summer, he would say it was the American bomber who killed and injured more than 20 of his guests. He has yet to receive an apology for the massacre of those innocents. If you ask any Palestinian child in Jenin a year ago, he would tell you a terrorist is the Israeli defense soldier who drove a Caterpillar bulldozer through 300 homes, manically laughing at his deadly work. If you ask any Chechen, they will tell you the terrorist who invade their lives or dressed as Russian soldiers, whereas Vladimir Putin has virtually written off all Chechens as terrorists. Margaret Thatcher once called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. It is also a serious misjudgment to say terrorism is a weapon of the weak. Like other means of violence, it is often a weapon of the strong, but when it is carried out by countries like America or Israel, it doesn't really count as terror, does it? It counts as protection. It counts as working for global peace. And now we have George W. Bush's war on terror, an excuse for a never-ending war carried out by a president who is sitting on a nuclear arsenal containing 6,000 warheads. The war on terror was launched to make the world a safer place, yet it has brought hardship and misery to the lives of millions across the globe. Today, I visited a school where the pupils had carried out an emergency evacuation drill. Should your children really be exposed to this sort of threat in their classrooms? The war on terror, as we all know, began in New York on September 11 and moved to Afghanistan 26 days later, where we saw the richest, most powerful nation in the world bomb the most poorest country in the world. There was outrage by international aid agencies who were trying at the time to get food to the millions of starving in Afghanistan who had no other source of food. Some of the Hazara people were forced to scratch through the snow to try and find grass to eat. But to show it was a caring nation, America decided on an initiative, and they dropped yellow-shaped picnic boxes containing peanut jelly butter and other non-halal food on one province. This act of kindness from the Pentagon was followed up some days later by bombing in the same region with cluster bombs. You know, those deadly yellow-coloured box-shaped bombs tied together with a web of mesh and wires. You can imagine what happened when the starving Afghan children went out to collect the yellow picnic boxes that day. When I spoke to a Pentagon official, he dismissed it as a mistake, a mere mistake. When I asked him about the non-halal contents of the picnic boxes, he said, "When you're starving, you'll eat anything. What is the problem?" You couldn't make it up. Then we had the liberation of Kabul. Women burned their burqas, men shaved off their beards, and other Afghans threw flowers at the incoming Northern Alliance army. It made a jolly show for the international media, who had actually paid the Afghanis to perform these little acts because it would make the folks back home in America and Britain happy. Only the Daily Mirror newspaper in Britain published a graphic front-page picture with the headline, "Welcome to our new best friends." The picture showed a badly beaten Taliban soldier pleading for his life before the conquering heroes blew off his head. Yes, America and Britain had cut a deal with a group of bloodthirsty warlords, or regional power brokers, as the Americans like to call them, and they happily carried out massacres and torture for Uncle Sam and the dollar. Even now, with the connivance of American special forces, some human atrocities beyond your wildest imagination are being carried out in Afghanistan. One day, someone will have to become accountable for these war crimes. Maybe now we know why America refused to sign up to the International Court last year, which would deal with the very war crimes that I'm talking about. Look at the Uzbek warlord General Rashid Dostum, a sheer brute of a man responsible for the suffocation of up to 1,000 Taliban soldiers in containers. Was it done with the blessing of America and Britain? Even if you look the other way, you are just as guilty, and we know Dostum is guilty as hell of war crimes. But hey, it's okay, he's our guy, says the US and Britain. This gross hypocrisy is bile-inducing. 8 Britons were arrested in Afghanistan after September 11. I was one of them, but I was lucky enough to be captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world. The others, along with 600 more, were captured by the Americans. They were shaved, shackled, beaten, blindfolded and flown to Camp X-Ray in Cuba, where they were thrown into open-air cages. They still today live in pens of 8 to 10 men and are forced to urinate and defecate publicly because the US wants to watch its enemy combatants at all times. We don't know who they are, we don't know what crimes they've committed, and we are not allowed to know their names. But we do know that at least one of these young men is from Bahrain, and I hope that you will do everything you can to demand his release. Maybe start tonight by sending the US Embassy letters of protest. So, having introduced complete chaos into Afghanistan, ignoring the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war, and violating countless human rights, is Afghanistan any better off thanks to the war on terror? Hamid Karzai, the head of the interim government, is known as the Mayor of Kabul because he has lost complete control of his country outside his capital. He can't even trust his own people to protect him, and he now surrounds himself by American bodyguards. His 15-strong new Afghan army, trained by the Americans, has lost half of its $2 a day soldiers. Not in action, they've run off with their shiny new weapons. 3 of his government ministers have been assassinated, and the first ever women's minister was hounded out of office last summer. I use the term office loosely because when I tried to track her down in those early heady days last January, she wasn't even deemed worthy of having her own office. 7 million people are still displaced and dispossessed as the international aid agencies continue to fight an uphill struggle to get food through lawless territories being run by bandits, thieves and warlords who no longer receive their American dollars. That friendship was very short-lived, wasn't it? Of course, this war had nothing to do with liberating the Afghan people from the brutal Taliban. Iraqi exiles take note. Now Bush and Blair want to liberate the Iraqi people, and I can understand their justifiable fears. Don't forget, the whole war in Afghanistan was launched to get one Mr. Osama bin Laden. Remember him? Tall guy, 6'4" in height, rides a white horse and often talks about killing the great Satan. He was the assumed mastermind, the architect behind September 11, until last week, and that mantle is now being given to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was captured in Pakistan. They seem to have conveniently forgotten about bin Laden, who is releasing more tapes these days than a pop star, and he continues his promises to increase the terror and violence against the West, a promise he has kept in the past with devastating consequences. When is Bush going to learn that his scattergun vengeance does not work? He and Tony Blair have become Al-Qaeda's finest recruiting officers by stamping around the globe, threatening anyone who doesn't dance to their tune. But instead of looking to blame someone, why doesn't Bush and his hawks just take one step back and ask why September 11 happened? We all know that the roots are wrapped around the Middle East and deeply embedded in Palestine. As a president, Bush prefers violence to negotiation or peace. He can barely disguise his contempt for those who are working towards peace as he gives his White House briefings. In fact, he is starting to look really bored. He is not interested in peace. He is not a man of peace, and he refuses to accept that terrorism, the attacks against his people and his country, have their roots deep down in a justifiable grievance. Do you really believe that de Klerk would have transformed South Africa had it not been for the fear of the bloodbath that the ANC threatened to unleash? Nelson Mandela is regarded as one of the most respected of world statesmen today. He knew that apartheid and all its evils could not be defeated without an armed struggle. I'm sure many of you can remember that glorious day when he walked out of Robben Island a free man. Do you really think that the Irish situation would have reached its present state of comparative peace if the Republican cause had been armed with nothing more than goodwill to all men? Tony Blair has invested a lot of time and effort to try and sort out the Irish solution back home, and I would have thought that he would have realised that this is now paying dividends and it is the way forward to sort out the Iraq issue. We all know that it was limited use of violence, including attacking civilian targets, which concentrated the minds of him and his politicians. As I said before, it is becoming increasingly difficult to tell the warriors from the terrorists, but Bush must understand that seeking out a peaceful solution is not a sign of weakness. That takes real guts, courage, and strength. The easy route was to answer violence with more violence, hence his war without end, the war against terror. But I'm not sure if anyone has really taken notice of who is running this war on terror, because in my humble opinion, it certainly is not George W. Bush or any of the Washington hawks who pull his strings. No, the show, in my opinion, is being run by Mr. Osama bin Laden. And if you look at the script and you accept that Al-Qaeda is behind September 11, or maybe behind September 11, I'll tell you why. Al-Qaeda attacks New York and the Pentagon, killing more than 3,000 civilians. America responds by attacking Afghanistan. $1 million bombs are dropped on $10 huts. Having spent billions of dollars turning rubble into more rubble, Al-Qaeda responds again by killing and maiming hundreds of young people in Bali, hitting an oil tanker in the Yemen, picking off American soldiers in US air bases in the Middle East, blasting Israeli holidaymakers in Kenya. America responds by sending an unmanned spy plane over the Yemen to blast a vehicle containing 6 Al-Qaeda suspects. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden respond by issuing more death threats and attacks against the West. So how does Bush and his sidekick Tony Blair react? They produce more laws and restrictions which carpet bomb our very liberties and freedoms. Our emails and faxes are being intercepted Our telephones and cell phones are being monitored, and I'm not just talking back in the UK and America. A huge scandal erupted in the United Nations Security Council last week when it emerged America had also been spying on all the members of the UN Security Council to find out what they were saying, who they were talking to, what they were thinking. So don't sit here comfortably thinking that you're free of all of this. It's not just a UK or an American problem, it's a global problem. In fact, when one journalist spoke to a member of the UN Security Council and said, "What do you think about America bugging your phone?" he said, "Why don't you ask the guy that's listening in?" Anyone with a beard or hijab stands a good chance of being photographed and fingerprinted if they go to the United States. In fact, my understanding is that Oman has issued a warning to its residents: don't travel to America unless it is entirely necessary. So, this is the war on terror, this is the fight back. Do you feel any safer? Of course not. Our security has never been less. In Britain and America, Muslims are being encouraged to spy on Muslims. They are being intimidated and are terrified of the threat of being removed from the country. Meanwhile, the White House and Downing Street are trying to whip its citizens up into a state of mass hysteria with yellow alerts, code reds, and all that nonsense. Osama bin Laden and his henchmen must be laughing their socks off at the moment. Thousands of infidels killed, chaos across the world, and Westerners terrified they are going to be blown up at any second. It is quite clear to me that George W. Bush is not in control of this war on terror. He is allowing Al-Qaeda to run circles around the greatest superpower, which has stronger armed forces than the next 27 countries put together. A tiny flea is keeping the American giant awake, and as it stamps and thrashes around the globe, it is causing chaos and misery to millions, but it is still nowhere closer to getting the flea. My guess is that Al-Qaeda would like to see total chaos across the Middle East, which could result in complete anarchy and uprisings in the Muslim world, resulting in the downfall of several Arab leaders, maybe even a return of the caliphate. It's an ambitious plan, more ambitious, say, than flying 2 American planes into the Twin Towers and ramming another one into the Pentagon. Now, who would be dumb enough to fall for that? Who would be stupid enough to ignore world and religious leaders and millions of peace campaigners? Who would be stupid enough to go charging into the Middle East with 300,000 crusaders and destabilize the whole region? Who would really go charging into a Muslim country without any real justification at all? A very tall man with a bushy beard is not only kicking the ass of the US president, but he is leading him towards Armageddon. Bush is not running the war on terror, he just thinks he is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ridley, for that frightening picture. From someone who has observed this firsthand for the last 17 months, to hear this kind of a talk is frightening indeed. And as most of us are fortunate or unfortunate enough to be in this part of the world where this war on terror is about to unleash, I think It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for all of us to sit back and think. And whilst we're doing that, it's also an opportunity to raise some questions that may be in our minds, that may already exist, that may have arisen as Mrs. Grimm and Miss Ridley made their presentations. John Kiesling's paper, Letter of Resignation, that Yvonne quoted from, we would arrange for it to be put on the website of Discover Islam. It is an amazing letter, and I invite you to read it. Also, President Jimmy Carter has written a letter, widely published in the US newspapers. We will put that on the web too. And I invite you to read that too, because who's listening? Ms. Ridley raised that question quite rightly. Is anyone listening out there? I think what's more important is that these people, John Kiesling, 20 years career diplomat, a proud diplomat, proud of his country, proud of his heritage, has put his life, his career, everything he has online. People care. 15 million people on the street, in streets of London, Manchester, Sydney, you name it. People do care. Whether someone is listening or not is another matter. But I think a point that Ms. Ridley made very effectively, someone will have to account for what's going on today. It is now your opportunity to raise questions either from Yvonne Ridley or Mrs. Grimm, and I'll open the floor for questions, please. I have a question from a lady. Some European and Americans are saying they do not agree on a war with Iraq if second resolution is not passed at the United Nations. Do they mean that it is okay if the resolution is passed? Is the war okay? What do you think? I presume this question is for you, Yvonne.
No to war, full stop. There is no point in dropping bombs on Baghdad. There is no justification to drop bombs on Baghdad. Hans Blix has got a difficult job, but it's starting to work. And we should allow the weapons inspectors time to finish their work. He is disarming. When George Bush says he is not disarming, I'd like to see what evidence he has, and if he does have any evidence, he should give it to Hans Blix, the man at the sharp end. No to war means no to war, full stop.
I have another question here. What reaction have you had from the audiences in the West on your views and experiences?
Well, I usually preach to the converted. There are very few people who want to turn up and listen to my views when they don't agree with me, although we do have some healthy debates. But the latest survey to come out of the UK this week shows that only 15% of people support the British Prime Minister in his desire to follow the unelected President of the United States into this war. There's huge dissension across Europe. Obviously, nobody in the Middle East wants to see this war happen. It just seems to be down to two men at the moment, and that is the twins of evil, as I call them, Bush and Blair.
Thank you. I have another question here that you did not mention the brutal butcher Ariel Sharon. Do you have any comments?
I'm glad you've raised that. When I said before that George Bush is not a man of peace, I couldn't believe it when he actually described Ariel Sharon as a man of peace last year, and to his undying shame, Tony Blair agreed. They say that they're going into Iraq because Iraq won't do as it's told, it won't come within the UN resolutions. Well, I have a document here that shows Iraq has violated and ignored 16 UN resolutions, but Israel has violated and ignored 72 UN resolutions. One particular resolution it has ignored 28 times. So what are we doing about Israel? Are there any UN sanctions against Israel? No. And the biggest fear is that if Bush does go into Iraq, he will use it as an excuse to try and change the political landscape of the Middle East, which will leave Israel dominant. And so the Arab leaders won't have to kowtow to the Americans in a few years' time, they'll have to kowtow to the Israelis unless they stand up and say no to America. So thank you for mentioning Ariel Sharon.
I think you've already addressed the next question, but I'll raise it just in case you want to add any comments. Why is Israel and Mossad being kept out of this war?
Well, the potential for anarchy is already there, and if Israel becomes involved in a potential war, then the whole war will become Zionized, and it will be like dropping a match on petrol. It will just erupt and tear right across the Middle East, and God knows what the long-term consequences would be.
The next question is about Afghanistan. As you say, the war on terror is run by Mr. Osama bin Laden. How do you rate the Taliban regime?
The Taliban?
Taliban regime, how do you rate them?
I thought that I read up quite a bit about the Taliban before I went into Afghanistan, and certainly after I left, and I thought that the Taliban regime was politically naive, and no one was more surprised than them to take over Afghanistan and end up with 95% of the country. And I think this was borne out by the fact that the spiritual leader, Mullah Omar, would never leave Kandahar. I think he was forced twice to go to Kabul to make a couple of speeches, but he preferred to remain in Kandahar. He didn't like to see world leaders or their envoys, and so these are not the actions of a man with huge political ambitions. I do think rather than ostracizing the Taliban, we should have bombarded them with aid and help and advice to rebuild the country, and that might have brought them in more mainstream and more open to other ideas to help improve the country. But instead they were demonized and ostracized, and this made Afghanistan a target for a lot of different dissident groups who had their own objectives to pursue.
Thank you. We have a question over there.
Hello, we all honored by this esteemed talk by Miss Yvonne Ridley. I just have a small question to her, and I want to know her opinion about it. What she thinks about Sheikh Zayed's latest suggestion.
Do you know what that is?
No, I was just going to say, can you expand on that, please?
Sheikh Zayed has suggested that Saddam should leave. That's what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, so what's your view? Sheikh Zayed is the ruler of United Arab Emirates. He has suggested that Saddam Hussein should leave and spare his people the agony of war and be granted an immunity.
Well, this was a suggestion originally put up by America, that there's still a chance if Saddam packs his cases and goes. And I was rather puzzled by that generous offer by the White House to Saddam Hussein, because earlier they were comparing him to Hitler and comparing their situation to the Second World War. And of course there is no way we would ever have said to Hitler after the Second World War, oh, here's a suitcase, you know, go and clear off to another country. It's all very well making these suggestions, but it's not the main problem. It's a pity the Sheikh wouldn't stand up to America and be as expressive to the Americans as that I would suggest many of the Arab leaders should have done. It's quite incredible because we know 99.9% of the Arab world do not want this war to happen. And it was a great chance for the Arab leaders to unite as one, and instead they traded insults about each other's moustache and beard and called each other monkeys, and it was a great chance for them to unite and protest to America that they didn't want this war either, and so that was a missed opportunity. I just don't think it's a solution for an Arab leader to say clear off. And where is he going to clear off to? Because Saudi has said he's certainly not coming into our country, which is not surprising since they've offered havens to so many dictators in the past.
Thank you.
First of all, I would like to express our appreciation and thanks for coming to us and speaking freely and speaking your mind. There's two separate questions. One, you indicated through your speech that Bush is not running the war, or at least the intention of at least bombarding Iraq. Then who is running the war in the state? If he is not the one, that's question number one. And second question, through your talk, you indicated you were lucky to be captured or at least be imprisoned by a highly developed country, and the captured of the highly developed country have a different treatment. Can you expand on that? Thank you.
The reason I said that Bush was not running the war on terror is that everything that Bush is driving to at the moment is something that I think has been planned quite a long time already by Al-Qaeda. I mean, there is no great love between Al-Qaeda and the Iraqi regime. In fact, I think there's mutual loathing there because Iraq is regarded as an un-Islamic country and secular, and of course Saddam at the moment is trying to use his religion to encourage loyalty to the Ba'ath Party, which was co-founded by a Christian. I just think that it's Al-Qaeda's goal to get the Americans into Iraq, and they will then use that as an ideal excuse to say, let's unite and let's free our brothers. And I think it will be a great excuse to also whip up more anti-American feeling, which is very easy to do these days, across the region. And as for Camp X-ray, you know, as I said before, they've violated every single human rights convention. When I entered Afghanistan, I did so illegally. I didn't have a passport. I was guilty of a crime of entering a country illegally. We don't know what any of these men have done. A lot of them probably don't know what they're supposed to have done. And, you know, there are over 30 different nationalities represented in Camp X-ray, and I think it's about time that the international community stood up to America and said, enough is enough. And my advice to any American living or working in any remotely hostile area is go back home, because if you are kidnapped or abducted, do not expect to be treated any differently to the Camp X-ray prisoners. Now I can imagine the headlines that there would have been around the world had I been paraded around, shaved, shackled, abused and blindfolded. I can see the headlines now. So why should America be allowed to get away with it? I don't know, I might be being very unfair to you tonight, but I know there's at least one Bahraini in Camp X-ray. I'm hoping that there's a campaign where you are bombarding the US Embassy with letters of protest and asking about it. It's no use being an armchair critic and sitting back and complaining amongst yourselves. You know, taking direct action can be something as simple as sending an email or writing a letter. If you let this happen to one of your citizens, it will set a trend. So that's just my view on the Camp X-ray situation.
I think on this specific point, there's a question that if we send protest letters to senators in the US or MPs in Britain, do you think they will get it? And if they do, will they be effective?
Well, I would start closer to home. I would send letters to the American Embassy and bombard them with letters and try and link up with families in other countries. I know that there's quite a strong organisation forming in the UK to try and do something, and lawyers are working round the clock to try and find one way of getting access to these men.
There's a question here that you've written a book about your 10-day ordeal in Afghanistan. How can we get hold of a copy of this book? And have you written any other books?
I've just finished a second book on September 11, which I'm hoping to find a publisher. And my first book is called In the Hands of the Taliban, and I think you can order it from a bookshop, and you can certainly get a deal on Amazon.com, especially if you organised yourselves and made a bulk order.
Thank you. Next question is about September 11, that according to the records, only one Israeli died who was on the aeroplane. And there is evidence that a lot of Israelis sold stock of insurance and airlines just a couple of days before September 11. Where did the cameras come from, and in your view, what does this mean?
I just don't go for conspiracy theories or cock-up theories. Somebody said to me, don't you think that the Americans planned September 11? And I have to say that September 11 was so simple and effective, it couldn't have been carried out by the Americans. They would have had Arnie Schwarzenegger involved, they would have had Star Wars programs, and they would still have missed the target. I just can't believe that it's I just don't believe any of the conspiracy theories, and I think that there were a number of Jews who did die in the Twin Towers and in some of the hijacked planes.
You have a question?
It seems to me that the war is between like three people, Osama, Tony Blair, and George Bush. So what are the motives that these individuals have? In a recent television interview, you mentioned that Bush has some shares in arms companies.
According to the records, only one Israeli died who was on the aeroplane. And there is evidence that a lot of Israelis sold stock of insurance and airlines just a couple of days before September 11. Where did the cameras come from, and in your view, what does this mean?
I just don't go for conspiracy theories or cock-up theories. Somebody said to me, don't you think that the Americans planned September 11? And I have to say that September 11 was so simple and effective, it couldn't have been carried out by the Americans. They would have had Arnie Schwarzenegger involved, they would have had Star Wars programs, and they would still have missed the target. I just can't believe that it's, I just don't believe any of the conspiracy theories, and I think that there were a number of Jews who did die in the Twin Towers and in some of the hijacked planes.
You have a question?
It seems to me that the war is between like three people, Osama, Tony Blair, and George Bush. So what are the motives that these individuals have? In a recent television interview, you mentioned that Bush has some shares in arms companies. And what can we do to kill these motives?
That was an unfortunate choice of word, but you're right. All three do have an interest in invading Iraq. Bush certainly does because of his business interests in the oil and the arms industries, and a lot of, well, all of his business interests now are in blind trusts, so that there's no, so that he isn't openly going to benefit from any of his decisions. But if he gets into Iraq and he gets his hands on that oil, as soon as he leaves office, he will be worth billions and billions more because of his investments. There's also the thing that he's got this, he needs to avenge his father's failure in the Gulf. And it's also been suggested that he's got this mother complex, and he has to prove to his mother that he's better than his father. You know, these are all valid theories. And Osama bin Laden, as I said before, if you accept that he was part of the September 11 planning, I think that he wants to bring total unity to the Middle East. And the only way that he can do it at the moment is by using Bush as a utensil to get that. And he could come very close to it. He's certainly got 99.9% of the Arabs behind him. If he stood up for an election anywhere in the Middle East, he'd probably get 100% of the vote. Tony Blair is just intoxicated with George Bush's power. We've tried to think of many reasons why Tony Blair has gone along with George Bush, and some people have said, well, he's been there as a restraining hand and he's influencing the White House. Tony Blair has absolutely no influence in America at all. And that was borne out in January this year when he tried to kickstart the Palestinian peace process by organising a conference in London, and Ariel Sharon refused to let the Palestinian delegation travel to that conference. And I'm sure he would have rung George Bush and said, will you sort out Sharon and let me get these people to London, because, you know, I want this peace conference to go ahead. And we all know the answer to that. We had a ridiculous situation where there was 2-3-way video links of people trying to discuss peace on two different continents. And then just a few weeks ago, there was a Briton on death row in Texas. And his lawyers said, if we can get some DNA tests through, we might actually be able to prove his innocence. And so Britain contacted Texas, home of George Bush, and said, can we have a stay of execution on the British-born man you've got on death row? And they said no and pulled the switch. So, you know, if we can't even stop one British-born man from having a stay of execution on death row in Texas, you know, it just shows that we have absolutely no influence in America whatsoever.
Could you briefly share with us your detention experience in Afghanistan?
Oh, we did that last night with the sisters, and we had a great evening. It was a very terrifying experience because I had bought into the propaganda that the Taliban were the most brutal, evil regime in the world. And one thing that I said to them was, you know, we're told that you're so evil you won't even let children fly kites. Our Prime Minister, Tony Blair, used that as an excuse, saying, you know, we've got to do something to stop the Taliban. They're so evil they won't let children fly kites. And they said, of course children can fly kites, but they can't fly kites in built-up areas because they'll get the kites wrapped around the wires, they get electrocuted. And I said, well, how can you get electrocuted with a piece of string? And then they explained to me that in that part of the region they like to put a little metal thread through the kite so they can chop each other's kites up as a game. And he said that the children would electrocute themselves, and quite often that the areas would be turned without electricity. And so I thought about this, and it was just a total manipulation of the facts. And I don't know how many of you have been to London during the festive period, but I would like to see how far I would get up Oxford Street flying a kite. It would be about 10 yards before I'd be arrested. So things were twisted and manipulated. And again, it's something that we're all going to have to watch out over the next few weeks, because they say truth is the first casualty of war, and at the moment it's in intensive care.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much for your excellent speech over here. And I would like to ask one question, that while people all around the world, ranging from Mexico and Australia and all other in Britain and UK and America, people are standing up against war, terror, what do you and how do you view and comment on the response of people in this world on this present risk of war?
How effective it is?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. These things are always hard to quantify immediately, but if we can just go back to the Vietnam War, it took 6 years for the Vietnam anti-war movement to really build up into a huge force. And secret documents that came out 10, 20 years later showed that President Nixon was going to nuke Vietnam. And he decided against dropping a nuclear weapon on Vietnam because he was told, if we drop that bomb there is going to be rioting in the streets back home. And so it proved how effective the peace protests were. And in Britain, it also emerged that the Prime Minister of the day, Wilson, decided against sending British troops on that US-led military venture because of the strength of protest back home. So there is a precedent where a British Prime Minister has actually stood up and said no to America. And although I said before that Tony Blair has no influence in America, I don't believe he does. But if he walked away now, that would really freak out the American people, because they would see this as another Vietnam looming, and they would then rise up and put even more pressure on the White House to stop and think again about this war. But you know, individually and collectively, we can all have an impact. nobody could have imagined that 2 million people would turn up in London on February 15. I'm sure you all know what the British are like. You know, it takes a lot for us to get very agitated and excited unless somebody doesn't queue properly, and then we show our teeth. But to get 2 million British people off their backsides on their day off to go and march in London was incredible. But the government did its best to try and stop that rally, which actually increased the numbers of support we got. And the reason why the government tried to stop the rally, they said you can't go and march and rally in Hyde Park because you will damage the grass. This is really, you know, these people are wanting to drop bombs on innocent women and children in Baghdad, but you can't walk on the grass in Hyde Park. And we've got a wonderful Labour MP called George Galloway, and he turned round to the government minister and he said, you can either have a rally of 1 million people or a riot. Either way, we don't care, we're turning up and we're doing it. And they capitulated, they had to, in the face of 1 million people coming to London. Anyway, 1 million more were so outraged that they were told they couldn't march on the grass. They turned up as well. So people power, it can have an impact. A letter in a newspaper can have an impact. You know, it's like throwing a stone in a pond. There will be ripples.
Thank you. We have a question there. Yes, please.
Ms. Ridley, my apology to come on the line once again regarding my question. I have 3 points to raise. First, regarding the question of Sheikh Zayed's suggestion, I haven't really understood exactly your analysis toward this. Are you aware of the fact that a lot of intellectuals in this country, as well as in all Arab and Islamic worlds today, they are all praising and endorsing Sheikh Zayed's suggestion, as well as Iraqi oppositions and intellectuals. In the same time, we are sitting here, a lot of intellectuals and writers all over the world, Iraqis, they are selecting petition toward that suggestion. It seems to be that is the only suggestion for the last moment to stop this vicious war. We all agree about it. Not only that, are you aware that a lot of politicians in this country, as well as the leadership of this country, praised, as a matter of fact, Sheikh Zayed's suggestion? This is one point. The second point, we know that the majority of Islamic world, they are against the war. As you said, 99%, though the majority, they are silent and waiting. But the majority of this world, Islamic world and Arabic world, they want to see democratic regime on this area. They don't want to see system like Saddam Hussein, because it is the only comparative between system like Saddam Hussein is you can compare it with Nazis and Germany during Hitler time. My third point is when you compared between Taliban regime and the regime of Hamid Karzai today, which it was brought by the military force and by the West power, you said that there is no change. I don't quite agree with you, Ms. Ridley, because today Afghanistan, thousands of people came back, thousands of women came back and studying in the school, hundreds of women riding or driving cars. So there is a big difference. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Well, if I wasn't aware before, I am now. And they're persuading Saddam to go into exile would be a great idea, but it's not the only solution. If the Arab leaders stood up to America, as the UN members are looking to do, as ordinary members of the public are looking to do, that could also provide another solution. You talk about democracy in Iraq. I'm not sure what sort of example that you're talking about, because I don't see much evidence of democracy in the Middle East. Although I have to say that Saddam was a creation of the West, and I can't imagine that America would want to replace him with a figure democratically elected by the people. It's not in George Bush's interest to have any democracy in this region. And as for the Taliban, there are a few green shoots of hope in Kabul, where no more than 20 women signed up last month for driving lessons. There are not hundreds of women driving in Afghanistan. As I say, more than 20 joined up for driving lessons. One encouraging thing that I did see last January, when the Kabul entrance exams were taken, more women than men passed the exams, which was a tribute to the many underground schools that are running or were running during the Taliban regime. But the lot of an Afghan woman has certainly not improved, and I can tell you that although the Vice and Virtue Squad set up by the Taliban may have gone, in Herat there's another squad which is, I think loosely translated, called the Chastity Squad, and they were responsible recently for pulling some young girls off the streets, aged 13 and 14, and having them taken to hospital and forcibly examined to see if they were still virgins or not. Now, if you think that's an improvement, I certainly don't. Afghanistan is in a hellish state. America is not a nation builder at all. And it's funny, if America was a nation builder, why doesn't it herald Afghanistan as the model and say, look what we've done in Afghanistan, and this is what we're going to do in Iraq? So, you know, that is my response. But yes, there are a few green shoots of hope. Meanwhile, fighting is still going on in the southern area of Afghanistan. The Taliban are regrouping, and they seem to have made some ungodly alliance with a warlord called Gulbenkian Hekmatyar, who was responsible for demolishing half of Kabul over a decade. And if that is the case, then the war in the south is going to increase, and the body bags of American soldiers will increase. At the moment it's standing near 60 with 140 wounded. These are more figures you will not get from the Pentagon.
Thank you. We are short of time, so can I please request that when you ask your question, try and be very brief. We have a questioner down there.
I would like to ask you that how helpless is America in the hands of Jews and Israel? I would like to quote an interview with one of the Carter regime advisor by Tim Sebstein, Hard Talk, that why Israel did not pull out from the Jenin after a very clear warning from George Bush. And the reply was that if they do that, then the whole administration may be deluged the next day. If I'm not wrong, that was the wordings. And that's my question.
I was in Jenin, one of the first journalists in Jenin, just after the Israelis had left, and I saw much of their handiwork. Ariel Sharon is a maverick. The White House can't control him. I'm told by some British politicians who possibly would be in the know that he's pure embarrassment and a wild card, and they were hoping that the Israeli people might vote for somebody different in the last elections. A lot is said about the powerful Jewish lobby. I happen to think that the arms lobby is far more powerful than the the Jewish lobby. And something very interesting happened today. Unfortunately, I didn't get much chance to watch it on TV, but just as I was about to leave, Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary, was talking about the situation in Iraq and backpedaling over whether we would or wouldn't go through a UN route. But he also brought Palestine in with the Iraq situation. Now, that's the first time I've ever heard that those two connected in recent months in the British Parliament, and I saw that as a very hopeful sign that at last the British Parliament has realised that there is an inextricable link between Iraq and Palestine, and certainly if it wasn't for the heroic resistance of the Palestinian people, George Bush would have been into Iraq a long time ago. And he couldn't, because these people created so much of a problem with what I can only describe, as I say, as heroic resistance. But the other thing that came out of Jenin, the UN immediately assembled a team of inspectors to go into Jenin and demanded that they investigate war crimes, and Ariel Sharon told them to get lost. Now then, can you imagine what would happen if Saddam had said the same thing to Hans Blix? You know, again, the hypocrisy, and that's why this diplomat, John Brady Keisling, has obviously had enough, and I suspect this will be the first of many resignations coming out of America's diplomatic corps.
Thank you. The next question is, why is the West turning a blind eye to what's happening in the Middle East? Are they aware of the things that you have said in your lecture tonight?
I'm assuming that you're talking about the Palestinian situation when you say turning a blind eye to the Middle East, because obviously the minds are very much focused at the moment on what is happening in Iraq. Palestine has been ignored in the past, and it's an outrage that it has been ignored by the West. But what I find even more of an outrage is that it has been ignored by the Arab world as well. You know, they're your brothers and sisters, and they are suffering. What has emerged out of the Stop the War coalition in Britain and in other peace movements, we're bringing them in together, saying don't attack Iraq and justice for Palestine. And I swear, when I stood up on the stage and looked across and saw 2 million people in Hyde Park, I swear I could have felt that this was the start of the road to Jerusalem. And, you know, I pray that the Palestinian issue isn't left to fester anymore. And I was greatly encouraged, as I say today, to hear the Foreign Secretary actually discuss Palestine in the same breath as Iraq.
Thank you. We have a question here from a sister.
Yeah, hi Yvonne. I've actually written my question down, but it doesn't look like it's going to be asked, so I'm going to cheat and jump the queue. I hope you don't mind. Yvonne, I wanted to ask you, everybody knows that in Bahrain there's a huge military presence of American and European personnel. Many of them have been here for many years, and but many of them have arrived because of the impending war in Iraq. And they are here legitimately, but most ordinary citizens, Bahrainis and non-Bahrainis, find this unacceptable actually. But, you know, I mean, in your opinion, what can ordinary people do? I mean, you can walk into a mall, for example, and be sitting there having your meal, and a group of, you know, American soldiers walk in, you know, and sit down, eat their meal, and you know very well that next week they're probably going to go to Iraq and murder all these innocent Iraqi children and women and elderly people. So, you know, what are we supposed to do as ordinary citizens? For example, should we ban them from the shops? Should we not allow them to have the flats and all the nice accommodation that they live in? You know, what are we supposed to do?
The first thing you should do is to try and get organised, even if it's just a small group. Small groups grow into big groups and bigger groups go on. And write letters to the authorities complaining of their behaviour and their lack of respect. I've heard some dreadful tales about the shocking driving of American servicemen in this country. And, you know, American servicemen do not have great records on other people's roads, as the people in South Korea will testify, when 2 10-year-old schoolgirls were killed and by American servicemen who refused to go through the judicial process in South Korea. So if there are any reports of bad behaviour, you should form a monitoring group and make a list of these. If there are any cases of bad driving, try and get the number of the vehicle and start compiling dossiers on the behaviour of these people, and try and get things like service numbers and names, and contact the authorities and copy in letters to the American embassy, and to you know, once you find, the thing is to find out who to write to first, and always copy in the letters and send a copy of the letter to the local newspapers as well. And, you know, it's, I know that you've got a huge naval base here. I guess that, you know, you've got to weigh up the pros and cons and the advantages and disadvantages of having them over here, but make them respect your country and the fact that they are in an Islamic country. I had to slap somebody down this morning, a non-Muslim who was belly aching that stores were actually closed during Ramadan, and I had to remind them that they're in an Islamic country, and on wonderful tax-free salary as well. But no, I mean, you form a monitoring group and let them know that you're watching them and that they cannot come into your country and treat the men, the women or the children with disrespect, and they certainly must adhere by the driving regulations, because you know, their record, as I say, of their behaviour abroad is quite shocking, and their ignorance towards people's culture, as I explained earlier today when I said that they were dropping non-halal food onto the Afghan people. They have no respect of people's cultures.
Thank you. We have a question down here.
Why do you think that it's just Muslims around the world that are being treated like this in Chechnya, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., you name it? Why just Muslims? Well,
Bush keeps saying that it's not a war against Islam, and then he'll start using words like crusade, and you start looking at all the bombs that America has dropped around the world since September 11, and every single American bomb has killed a Muslim. I mean, you know, that is without a doubt. I could understand why America would see Islam as a big threat. It has to have an enemy, like it had communism. You know, the big thing used to be communism. And of course, Islam is more than a religion, it's a way of life. And people's first and foremost duty is towards their faith. And the Americans are afraid of this, and they're afraid of the power and the potential power and strength of Muslims united. And I know that Muslims are united from the bottom. It would be great to see the Arab leaders united as well.
I will just ask two last questions and then we'll draw this evening to a close. Do you think it is a beginning of a clash of civilizations as written by Samuel Huntington?
That's a question that could go on for hours, and it sounds like a good debate for another time.
Very wise response. There are several questions here which I will combine into one, and you're going to need your crystal ball. They're saying that there are 240,000 US and British soldiers in the Middle East. Can the war really be averted at this late stage? And in your opinion, when do you think the war is going to start?
Right. Well, it's amazing the military build-up in the Middle East, and when you consider the whole concept of bin Ladenism erupted because there were a few thousand American soldiers hidden in the Saudi desert, God knows what 250,000 troops in the region, what effect it could cause, especially in an invasion of Iraq. But there won't, if war does go ahead, there won't be a land invasion first, because we all know that America likes to bomb the hell out of a country from 30,000 feet first. And one of the plans that the Pentagon has is 60 days and 60 nights of bombing over Iraq. That is a barley in every street, in every town, in every village, in every city, right across the country. Now, when I was last in Iraq, the strategic military targets had been moved into civilian areas. So we're talking casualties on a scale almost beyond comprehension. The aid agencies, who are the experts, are talking about tens and tens of thousands of Iraqi deaths and more than 1 million refugees. However, having said all of that, I won't answer the last question, because I really believe that the war can still be halted at this last stage. I think it's going to take every ounce of prayer, every ounce of patience, and the peace movement, February 15 wasn't just the end of a lot of work, it was the beginning, it was the emergence of a superpower, 15 million people across the globe marching. The majority of the world leaders united against this war. China, Russia, half of Europe. Absolutely incredible, and one of the most potent forces are you, the people, individually and collectively. You can make a difference. 300 women held a peace march in Bahrain the other day for International Women's Day. Fantastic response. It's, as I said before, it's no use being an armchair critic. This affects every single one of us. Your kids are doing evacuation drills at school. It's obscene. It's affecting you here and now, and you've got to stop it. And as I say, anything that you can think of to do, whether it's writing letters, whether it's joining the vigils, whether it's joining marches, let people know that you are not prepared to let this happen. And as I say, just use every ounce of prayer power, because I truly believe that it's still not too late.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. On behalf of all of you and on behalf of Discover Islam, I would like to thank both Mrs. Grimm and Ms. Yvonne Ridley for their great contribution in sacrificing their personal time and life to this dedicated cause of peace, for sharing their thoughts with us tonight, and much more importantly, answering these questions with thoughtfulness and a lot of patience. I would like you to join me in thanking both of them. I would also like to take this opportunity to say just 2-3 few words about Discover Islam. Discover Islam is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to propagation of the message of Islam, dedicated in a great effort to try and clarify what Islam is all about. Islam is the most misunderstood religion in the world, and Discover Islam devotes time, effort and resources in trying to clear that misunderstanding. I think they deserve all the support that you can give them, and certainly I would like to thank them tonight for having brought these two distinguished ladies to Bahrain and having enabled all of us to share in their experiences and thoughts. So my thanks to Discover Islam. I would also like to thank Baitul Quran. As always, they are very kind and share their resources, their facilities with us. God bless them, and God enable them to do so more often for all of us. One announcement: tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock, Miss Yvonne Ridley would be on BTV Highlights, 8 p.m. tomorrow night. Those of you who wish to watch, that will be a great opportunity to share to hear her more thoughts. Finally, I would like to thank all of you. This has been a long evening. You've been very patient, and I think we all go away from here with some very clear and loud messages as to what we as individuals, we as a community, as Bahrainis, we as an Ummah Muslims can do to help the cause of peace and try and eradicate the word, as Yvonne quite rightly suggested, of terrorist. I'm not saying we will succeed, but we owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to future generations to make the effort. Thank you very much.